Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm joined once again by Dr. Eric Helms, a leading researcher, coach, and pro natural bodybuilder. You probably know of Eric, but if you didn't, he's a great dude. It's been 9 months since we last spoke about Eric's uni-corn off-season gains. We're checking back in to see how things have progressed. Eric just wrapped up a mini-cut, putting himself in a better position for his up-and-coming contest prep. We'll dive into what he's learnt along the way, his updated thoughts on training volume, and why and how he is able to get close to 30 sets per muscle group per week for many muscle groups, and some key takeaways on protein intake when dieting based off his recent publication along with Martin Refalo and Trexler, plus his thoughts on the debate on protein between Menno Henselmans and Milo. Lots to be learned in that discussion, plus a large discussion surrounding science communication and the whiplash a lot of science consumers are feeling when they're seeing studies come out on a regular basis that seemingly contradict one another, leaving many confused and with whiplash. Eric dives into that, and we discuss how we might be able to consume this information better, and if you are a science communicator, some key aspects you should be aware of for yourself and your own individual approach towards putting out information across social media. As a reminder, guys, if you enjoyed this chat, you'll love the mass research review, of which Eric is one of the prime authors over there. We are an affiliate with them. We love what they do, and I consume it on a very regular basis. It inspires many of my posts. It helps me with coaching my clients, and also I take parts of it to help my own training as well. So if you're interested in the sort of things we discussed today, you'll love the mass research review. It's an absolute must for competitors and coaches within this scene, I would say. So guys, if you want to train smarter, not just harder, remembering hard training is smart training, this episode is packed with insights you do not want to miss. Let's get into it. Eric, as we were just saying off air, it's been far too long since I got to sit down and talk with you, and especially kind of bring you on the podcast. 9 months now. Thankfully, you have your own podcasts coming out regularly with, 3 podcasts. Yeah, so you truly are a podcast fiend. So that was episode 411. We're over 450 episodes now. We're talking about your uni-corn gains, and gains basically expected beyond that of an advanced lifter, which was a really great episode. If people haven't heard it, I definitely would recommend checking that one out. And so I thought it would be good to get a bit of an update on you. If people aren't following your series over at 3DMJ's YouTube, many probably are. You just finished up a mini cut, right? And you're a little bit heavier than you were intending to be, but for like people hear that and think that's negative, but not necessarily, right?
No, yeah. So, first off, thank you. It's always great to be back on, and I love that the only reason we don't talk more is because we're both too serious about our life, and we live on islands in opposite hemispheres. So, yeah, you're not going to stay up too late. I'm not going to get up too early because we're both friggin' bodybuilders first and podcasters second, despite the fact that I have so many podcasts. However, Iron Culture Mass Office Hours have merged, so I'm just down to 2, Steve. It's just
true.
Iron Culture presented by Mass and the 3DMJ podcast, and then, appearing on everyone else's twice a week. But so things are going well. I did just finish a mini cut, and like you said, for all the right reasons, I am heavier than anticipated at the end of it. So we are doing what your audience would be well familiar with, the pre-prep positioning phase. So essentially I hit a peak off-season weight in 2024 in mid-November at like 91 and a half-ish. And, sending off my videos to Brian and Berto, who are kind of my co-coaches in the off-season and season. And we're kind of making that transition as I move towards my 2025 prep. So I'm, keeping them both looped in, and they were like, yeah, this is a good spot, but we probably want to start prep a little leaner, like in April than this. So let's cut past that and then give you some room to be in a surplus for at least a couple months. The idea there is we get as close to my lower intervention point as possible, but not be in a dieted state at the start of prep to give me the best chance to be really, really lean, like, Steve Hall lean is the goal, based upon your last successful season, buddy. Excellent work. So we thought I would need to cut down to 86, around 190 for the Americans listening, and then come back up from there. And I was just sending videos to them rather than giving them body weight to know what they actually cared about seeing. And I hit 87 and a half, and they were like, that's perfect. That's good. And pretty lean, man. Like by far the leanest 87 and a half that I've ever been. Um, and now I'm sitting around 88, and it's been 2.5 weeks. So, probably most of that's just glycogen and additional poop. So yeah, it's been going really well. A really interesting thing that I've done is I got away from the 5.5 day splitish thing that I was doing with Brian, because I was mini cutting, and I was like, you know what? This will be a little bit of a microcosm of what prep is like, where I'm dieting while trying to sustain something similar to what I do in the off season. I don't plan to try to keep the exact same program when I'm shredded, of course. And the biggest challenge I find with my training is I'm doing a lot of volume. I'm doing it at a very high intensity, and I'm doing a lot of hard exercises. So some of those days are marathon sessions. If when my headphones have like not charged well, I'm like, oh shit, I'm gonna need Eye of the Tiger on that 4th set of leg press when I potentially hit failure, and I don't have it. So we're just gonna have to take it rep by rep. So anyway, what I decided to do, with permission from my coaches, is basically train daily, and took another page out of the Steve Hall playbook. And I said, you know what? Some days when I have the time availability, because I do have a home gym and I only have to walk 10 minutes to get to the AUT gym, let me do 2 days. So I'll come in. A great example is today, I'm going to go in and do leg press, leg extension, calf raise. And then, after we hop off the podcast, it'll be 10 to 11 a.m., that kind of time frame for me. And then around 4 p.m., I'm going to go back in and do my upper body work. And it worked really well during the mini cut. I was able to preserve the same type of training intensity, quality, and I think I am going to basically, whenever possible, bring that into prep. So I have now, it looks crazy. Like if people don't know the context, they just think I'm an idiot, right? Which is fine. They see, like, they just follow me on my Instagram stories. It's like, oh, he trained twice today and he doesn't take any off days, which is not true. I take an off day if and when needed. I do auto-regulated deloads. I'll throw in BFR if tendonitis is going in there. So I'm definitely doing the tools I need for fatigue management, but I haven't increased my volume. I'm still doing roughly 20 to 30 sets for most muscle groups, and closer to 30 for some of my weak points, which is a lot, don't get me wrong, but it was what was working very effectively and not dissimilar than we talked 9 months ago to what I was doing. And now I am just spreading it out. And the outcome has been that the quality has been higher. And I even feel like I'm seeing more progress because of it, especially now that I'm moving into like a small calorie surplus again. I was looking good during the cut, very pleased with it, and then about a week post cut, I was like, oh shit, I look even leaner now that I'm filled out. And I think it's the best my physique's ever looked at 88. So I'm very cautiously optimistic, and I am due to start prep in basically 2 months, because we're almost on the 1st of Feb as we record this.
Very exciting. Lots of things to cover there, actually. Lots of thoughts that come to mind. I appreciate the props for how lean I ended up getting. It's I think you may have listened to the chat I had with Cliff, where we essentially thought, hey, took it a bit too far, maybe even at some point, where just you get to those essential levels of body fat and you're robbing Peter to pay Paul type of deal at that point. So yeah, it'd be great to see you getting even leaner than you've been before, because you've been, I guess in your words, legally shredded many times. And do you have now you've done that mini cut and that kind of positioning period, do you have an idea of how much muscle you think you might have gained now? Has that given you kind of some insight into that?
It does. I like my 2023 prep, like if you looked at my pictures the day after Worlds, I was looking at that and I was like, that is pretty friggin' lean. Like if I can get leaner than that, we're talking grams, and I think I can do it. But I think, you and Cliff talked about this really well. The appearance of leanness has so much to do with body fat distribution, how much you can maintain muscle fullness, and then how muscular someone is, really. So I do think I am going to look leaner this year, even if I was to get to the same conditioning level. which is cool. Like if I had the same amount of total fat mass on me, I will try to push to get even leaner than that. Of course, without Berto letting me flatten myself out too much. Um, and I think if I had to predict, I'm going to say very conservatively, maybe a kilo heavier on stage at the same condition.
Lovely. That's great. At this kind of, how many years have you been training? Over 20, right?
Yeah, man, 2004.
Yeah.
So this will be in May. It'll be my 21st year of training. So my training will be able to legally drink in the US in May, and we're going to party. Yeah. So,
And I mean, I just think of a kilo of meat. Like that's a lot. Even though it's spread over the rest of your body, it will show when you compare photos and when you are in the pro ranks now that you are, like it's small points between people. So, and on your physique, like you have not like the most favorable structure like many might have. So it counts even more at that point, I think. So yeah, I think it's going to be exciting to see how you do. In many ways, I mirrored your last prep, and so again, I'm inspired to see what you've done this off season and continue to follow in your footsteps, hopefully, and see how you do in the pro ranks again. And something else I wanted to talk about, Eric, actually was I think I heard you talking about it recently, and it's definitely something when you said it, I heard you on another podcast talking about it. It really clicked for me where you had this little bit of a mentality shift regarding volume, because I do remember in the past that you were concerned at times where you might be able to do more and recover from more, but is it actually leading to more growth, or are you just doing more because you have the capacity to do it? Whereas now, listening to the number of sets you're doing, there does seem to be a mentality shift where it's more so like, hey, if you can recover from it, it's not taking away from any other things that could be helping growth, then it probably is a net positive.
especially if you're seeing other performance indicators that it is beneficial. And that's probably something that sometimes gets lost in the conversation. So I've hit 3 lifetime PRs on leg press in the last 2 months. Like I did 360 kilos for 5. And I am, despite the recent study that indicates it doesn't actually enhance quad growth, I have been going all the way down, like calves on the hamstrings, knees in my chest, kind of leg pressing. I've hit a lifetime PR on incline dumbbells while dieting. So I can recover, and that's one thing. It's like we know that people can recover from astronomical levels of volume. It's called CrossFit. We see it. You can train for it, and doing a ton of work is something that we see in sport all the time. And it doesn't necessarily benefit you. There's actually these classic studies, I think from the 80s or 90s, where they took these super elite level swimmers and they were swimming an ungodly amount, like a full-time job worth of swimming volume, cut it in half, and there was no change in performance. So we know that you can do a lot, adapt to doing a lot, get very good at doing a lot, but obviously that's a parallel. It's not hypertrophy, but it is a general sense. The adaptation of doing the work is not the same thing as the actual outcome. And it's really related to intensity, right? To do a lot of work, you have to do it at a lower intensity, but then the thing you actually test it at, and we're talking about performance, is at a higher intensity. And you typically get a pretty poor return on investment. And we look at the volume relationship with strength, it's very different than hypertrophy. Hypertrophy, though, it's a physiological adaptation. It's not performance. It's a little different. And you just have to kind of decide, is the diminishing returns worth it? And most of the time I would say no. And then, the big mindset shift I've had is, prior to this meta regression, there was far fewer studies that could, in a continuous manner, describe the relationship between volume and hypertrophy. We had these kind of categorical comparisons, and we had a few, hints at the overall relationship, but we didn't have a good idea of the overall shape of it, and when and if and where and to what degree did it become the inverted U, which it still is, by the way. It must be. If you do enough, there will eventually be something that harms you from doing more, whether it is injury, muscle damage that actually results in basically muscle injury and atrophy, the inability to train, burnout, or actually maybe overtraining syndrome if you really push it that far. Just because we haven't observed it doesn't mean it's not possible. So we know that inverted U is somewhere out there. And I think when we had just a smattering of very high volume data, and anytime you're looking at marginal effects with small sample sizes, what you are going to observe is going to be some variance around that effect in those studies. And this is a phenomenon called sampling variance. And it's something that causes probably the most amount of confusion in the evidence-based community. It's currently happening related to length and bias training. It's currently happening related to volume, as I'm talking about, and protein intake, where if there is a known true effect, or sorry, if there's an unknown true effect and it is trivial positive, right? If we're talking effect sizes, it's like 0.2, 0.15. It's real. It's a thing, but it's marginal. It's the type of effect that you wouldn't be able to readily discern on your own. Like if you had 12 weeks of taking creatine or a placebo, I don't know, I think I got a few more reps here and there, and then that's creatine. It definitely works. We know it. We have enough research to know it. When we look at these studies in our field of sports nutrition or exercise science, we're typically talking about 30 subjects or less, right? 30 people coming out to participate, typically 6 to 20 weeks long if we were to kind of span 95% of studies. When there is a true positive but trivial or small effect size out there, if you take 10 studies and most of them are underpowered, you should anticipate that you will get mostly neutral and maybe some positive significant findings and potentially one errant negative finding. And we know this from statistics. You can simulate this so that there's no question to it. You can simulate 10,000 people and a small positive effect size or a trivial effect size, and then you can simulate studies where we go, well, that's the real effect in the true population, and now we're going to take 20 of them. How many times, if we do 10 studies with 20 people, do we see a representative effect size? And it's rare. Sometimes you'll get something that exaggerates it. That's kind of like that phenomenon of the first study on a topic tends to be, really positive, and that might be due to the file drawer effect. 3 of the people did it, and we didn't find nothing. And then the one person who gets it through peer review, it's because they actually had a large effect. Right? But it's not, I know the large effect is over exaggerating what we see. And then the next one that comes out, just by probability and regression to the mean, it's null, right? So we're seeing that right now with the lengthened bias training stuff. We got that leg press study and we got the lateral raise study, and everyone's like, oh, I guess the quads and the delts don't respond to lengthened bias training. And it's like, well, hold on. What about these 4 other studies? And what should we expect? We should expect to see neutral effects. We should expect to see nulls. And I think that's a really tough thing for people to understand because we don't think probabilistically. It requires a little bit of statistical nuanced understanding. So in the volume literature, you go back to say just 5 years ago, we had some of the German volume training studies, and some of them found not necessarily clear negative effects between groups, but there was greater within group effects for the lower volume groups. And even if you look at the second edition of my books, I can say, hey, there's a handful of studies here where a moderate volume group performed better than the high volume group. So maybe that inverted U is starting to occur around, say, after that 10 to 20 set mark. And that also lined up really well with the 2 metas that we had at the time. Schoenfeld with 10 plus, and then we had Bas Val saying, for 1 muscle out of 3, 12 to 20 did better than, 20 plus did better than, or 20 did better than less than 20, right? So when I triangulated that all, I'm like, there's probably this inverted U, and it almost makes it sound like there's this insidious thing where you could be doing more work but getting slightly worse gains, and how would you know? But I think with the clarity that we now have from the Pelland and meta-regression, we now kind of have this understanding that it's extremely diminishing returns, and it is uncertain and unclear once we're in like the more than 30, maybe more than 25 if you want to be really conservative set range. But it's not going to sneak up on you. There's no physiological reason why doing additional work is going to directly result in some type of downturn in the rate of hypertrophy that will be insidious or not noticeable. It's going to be, you are now training further from failure. You're pacing yourself. You have tendinitis. You can't sleep because of DOMS. You spent too long in the gym and you missed a meal. You're getting in and you're not able to complete all the other things you have to do in your life because of the time investment. It's creating stress. So your stress levels are higher. So the way I think the guys at Data Driven Strength present it very well is that more volume is beneficial until it's working against you. And I think that's something that doesn't go unnoticed. Um, and the only thing I layer on top of that is, listen, we want more. I still don't think we should go like old school RP style, before, they instituted the concept of MAV, because people forget there was a time when it was just MRV, right? um, and the idea of there being a maximum adaptive volume is going, okay, you could adapt to doing more, but you're not going to adapt more from doing it. And the idea that I don't think I want people to take from the meta regression is that, yeah, if all else is the same, you should just do more. I think you probably still want to rely on there being some type of performance indicator being better when you experiment with higher. So I'm not afraid of experimenting with higher. Like, hey, we're making decent gains. Why not? Let's go from 15 sets to 18 sets and everything. See what happens. Give it 3 to 4 months. Do you adapt to it? Does a repeated bout effect do its job? Are you able to recover? Okay, now you're doing 18 sets. Do we get any indication that things are a little bit better at all? And if the answer is no, then we go, okay, well, maybe that wasn't worth it. So I think certain things need to align. First, your goals, time availability, and I think honestly your experience level in the gym to where you're capable of handling a high volume without losing intensity is when you should think about, adjusting volume upward. The way that I really like viewing volume is as the dose. And the reason why I like viewing volume as the dose is because it actually requires you to hold intensity to a fixed standard, right? So I think over nearly 80% of the studies in the meta-regression by Pellman and colleagues were to failure by one definition or another, but we would describe them as high intensity protocols, even if, there's a few subjects in each study who it was defined as voluntary failure and then maybe a 1 or 2 RIR. I'd say the average RIR out of those 78% of studies was probably 0, so a high intensity protocol. In these studies, when you have 3 groups, like one is doing 10 sets, one's doing 20, one's doing 30 sets, they're all at that same RIR. The lab group is ensuring that, right? That's not what happens a lot of the times when people increase volume in the real world. Their RIR increases as their volume goes up. And sometimes it's done intentionally. Certain protocols, they think, oh, let's push the volume. And to do that, we're going to need to pull back the intensity. And I don't think that really makes sense either these days. So no longer am I afraid of the insidious, inverted U. I think you will know when you are doing too much. I do think you probably want to have performance indicators to say, hey, that increase did something positive for me. And then the third thing is that make sure when you're increasing the dose, that the dose is actually going up, because the overall relationship between increasing the number of sets and increasing the amount of hypertrophy you get is dependent upon that being a fixed factor. The proximity to failure, the same exercise selection, the same effort intensity, and all the things that are controlled for in these studies. So if you turning up the volume results in a reduction in those other things, we can't be confident that it's actually going to be increasing the stimulus, because the relationship between sets and hypertrophy, if you look at what's called the R-squared score, which is just squaring the linear relationship between the two, like the Pearson value, if you will, in very simple terms, that tells you how much of the variability or the variance in that relationship is explained by the other variable. So how much of the relationship or how much does volume predict hypertrophy? And it's only about 25% of it. So that means that if you're thinking about this from a betting perspective, if I'm gambling, right? If I want to have a good chance of increasing my hypertrophy, if I'm turning up volume, but it results in me changing exercises to ones that have a poorer resistance profile, which we have data, it's probably not as good on average, and it results in training further from failure, which from the same, lab group, Robinson and colleagues, it's probably going to be lesser stimulus. There's a decent chance that I have just done more work and spent more time in the gym for nothing, or even potentially reduce the stimulus. Um, and that's a complex interaction that we can't, predict or model yet. But I would say anytime increasing volume reduces literally any other variable that might be positively impacting hypertrophy, that's a time that I wouldn't take that bet. So I think that's the real nuanced perspective that I think gets missed a lot when we're talking about this on social media.
Very well explained. A lot there, but very well explained in regards to, in particular, what you mentioned there in terms of like more is better is what people hear, but then they miss all the nuanced discussion of, okay, it's not just volume that leads to a hypertrophic stimulus. It is exercise selection, it is intensity, it is these other variables that have a big impact too. And I've kind of termed it the volume trap, where people get into this situation where they are like, oh, more is better, and they add and add and add, and either that leads to them having to deload way sooner than they would have had to because they just force themselves into this kind of unsustainable training, or more often than not, the quality just goes real low, where they're just like, they are subconsciously, even if they don't know it, holding back because they're like, I got 5 sets on this thing, like 5 sets of hack squats. And I've been there and I've done that. And I think it's so important to start with a baseline of, like you said, basically get all the other things in check and then play around with the dose and see how you respond from there versus piling it all on and hoping that you have the other things in check. It's very different. You mentioned that 25%. Where would you put the other percents, just so that everyone's clear?
That's a tough one, because essentially what you would need to do is look at other studies or other meta-regressions and then look at their explanatory power. Yeah, the RIR relationship is less clear with hypertrophy. Like when you look at the graph, like, yeah, I could see there's a trend line, but I just did a reel recently for mass where I talked about going to failure. And I'm like, this isn't the cleanest relationship. But if we look at the 0 RIR, look at where these are all clustering. And like it's every study except for one is an increase in hypertrophy, and there's some study where they made them train to failure and they lost muscle, which would just be depressing, right? And that study group, and it ranges from like 1% increase to 20%. So it just goes to show you that alone should tell you something, right? So like if we go, you know what, you train to failure, it'll take care of everything else. You get at least 10% gains in hypertrophy. Not true, right? So if you change the exercise selection, volume, participant population, nutrition, all that stuff, you get this massive spread. But you can see that massive spread. And then if you look down at 8 RIR, the spread is basically downshifted. There's still that massive spread, but you're not seeing any studies where they're getting, 20% increases in hypertrophy. So it's this thing where we're trying to extrapolate a hugely multifaceted outcome, hypertrophy, right? Which is why proxies are so tough. Like even if EMG did predict hypertrophy perfectly, it would still only be in certain conditions, right? So if you imagine, let's say that EMG did perfectly tell you about motor unit recruitment, how many were on and how much stimulus they got. If I tested 2 different exercises, lat pull down versus, the single arm cross body, one, and like, yeah, it's 20% better. And we should expect 20% more hypertrophy. What if I gave that to you and me, and that was the only back exercise we did for 3 sets? We'd probably both lose a little bit of muscle mass. And we're like, oh my God, AMG was completely wrong. Like, or not. Or like we gave it to people and then gave them 500 calorie diets for 8 weeks. Like they lost lean body mass. EMG is trash. It's like, no, there's a billion things that impact hypertrophy. So it's really challenging. So the long answer to that question is, I don't know, man. Or the short answer, I guess. But each one of these things has some degree of explanatory power, and it's not without these big data sets that we can get kind of an idea on average. So it's tough, but I would say that 25% is actually kind of a big number when you think about it. How much of that variability does volume explain? I'm not sure that's a perfect representation of the one true relationship, but it's based upon the biggest data set we have. That's in like roughly 36 studies across 1,000 participants. And I think 60-40 split between trained and untrained individuals. So yeah, that's the meta regression is kind of a game changer in my opinion, in terms of like us having confidence in an average response, which is totally different than any individuals. So yeah, I would say, when you collectively put all of training together, maybe we're talking 50% of the variance in hypertrophy. And then the other 50%
Right.
probably has mostly to do with individual factors, right? So,
Yeah. Very well said. I'm out of interest. You mentioned so most muscle groups are at 20 to 30. Does that mean you're not doing specialization at this point? It's like everything is on the front burner, or are there some things you've left on the back burner? And in addition to that, have you found anything like a lateral delt, which I know for you is somewhere that you've been really focusing on? You almost feel like you could just, like it is joint and connective tissue that maybe stops you going even higher?
well, I am close to 30 on like, some are closer to 20. And I would point out that, 20 to 30 is a 10 set range. So like my back is the highest. I have the most volume on my back right now. My delts are also close to 30. And then my lower body is all in like the mid 20s. And like my lumbar only has like, like 14 sets or something like that. So there's some groups that I'm not really focusing on. So at this stage, I went through kind of a balance, then I did specialization for my lats, and now I'm kind of balanced again. I will probably do another lat specialization phase where I push most things back closer to 20, and then I bring that up closer to 30 or slightly higher again before we start prep. And then prep will be probably balanced again. And I'm kind of like, what I'm thinking about doing is kind of thinking of it from like, all right, I know what I can tolerate and what I seem to be benefiting from. I don't quote unquote need to be at 20 to 30 sets to progress. I think that's a really important thing as well. I'm pretty sure that I would progress just slower if I was hanging around 15 to 25. Um, so what I might do is kind of figure out like, what do I consider extra credit? And then when do I feel up for it based upon the ever changing nature of prep energy during training, or different phases. It might look a lot different when I'm 24 weeks out versus 2 to 4 weeks out. Right. So, yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it reminds me of people still, they're like, how can you recover from that? I was doing an upper lower split for basically the majority of my off season, so 3 times a week frequency on things, and it was towards maybe the last, and I'm still doing it now, the last 2 months of prep. I moved it down to just a push pull legs split basically, because I was like, I'm not recovering from this, and psychologically legs every other day when you're in prep was just starting to become a bit torturous. I actually preferred just getting it done and be like, right, I've got a few days to recover for the next one. So it makes a lot of sense that that's the way you're going. And something important I did want to flag up was, I kind of think this in relation to protein and kind of, hey, more might be better, but it's like diminishing returns, and like you might not actually get anything more from having more in some instances, or you might just get slowly less gains. So similar here, it's like you're not having to do that many sets to grow at all. It's just you're trying to maximize completely. There's diminishing returns, and so you could be gaining from like quite considerably less volume.
Yeah. And I think that is another one that people really struggle with is, context is condition, right? So what is ideal for a 12-week period or even a off season is not the same as what is ideal for the entirety of your training protocol. And we just so badly, we want studies to give us the answers that we personally want in our lives rather than studies giving us the answers they give us. And that's fair, right? And, we talk about translation or applied research. It is meant to be translated to practice and applied, but it's not meant to be applied directly. This is not an exact science. This isn't a drug trial where we had a zero exposure placebo, compared to a control group, compared to, you know, the actual drug. And we can do it in a multi-site hospital design across multiple nations and go, yeah, in these 10,000 people, we saw this number of adverse effects, this amount of change. It was, significant in terms of statistical significance, but clinically, it wasn't that meaningful. It only dropped blood pressure 5 points. So you know what? We're not going to go to development in this blood pressure drug without, trying to get that down to a more clinically meaningful amount. We ain't there. We ain't going to get there. That's just not what we're dealing with. So we have to kind of really think about, what does the study tell us? And in most of these studies, we're looking at direct measures of hypertrophy of a handful of muscles. So, an ultrasound muscle thickness, occasionally an MRI muscle volume, or, CT scan like that, or cross-sectional area. with panoramic view, all the good stuff. And that means that if we're measuring 2 to 3 muscle groups, many times these are studies where they only are training a single muscle group. It's a bicep curl study. Or it might be a full body, quote unquote, training protocol. Not that they train full body every time they come in, but they're training all of their muscle groups in some type of split. But it's heavily emphasizing the muscle groups that we're actually measuring, right? So that means that you're getting these studies that on average are 10 and a half weeks long if you look at the meta-regression. And like I said, most are going to fall into that 6 to 20 range. And they're doing specialization cycles. So what we really know confidently, if we want to talk about what's directly related to practice, is that a specialization cycle where you get closer to 30 sets is going to be the most effective way to grow muscle for those muscle groups over a 2 to 3 month period, maybe, 2 to 4 month period. And that's a very different answer than how should I train in perpetuity for my whole career? Should I do all muscle groups that way? And, what is there's not markers of how much tendonitis did you get, and there weren't questions around how long do you think you can sustain this type of training. Do you think you could maintain the same proximity to failure if you didn't have 5 graduate students yelling at you? Those are all really relevant questions that we do not answer in the studies. We can't answer them, and that is the whole reason why it is not an exact science, and coaching is also an art. So, and bodybuilding is an art, right? Just as an individual lifter, you can't just completely lose all of the real world information. While anecdotes are not as powerful as actual research findings simply can't fill the niche that anecdotes can. We don't have access to all that information. If it is not something measured, it is not something reported. So given that, we just really have to understand the limits of data, and we have to then try to integrate it with our experiences in some type of way. And we just accept the fact that, neither one is ever been intended to be the end all be all for program design, prescription, adjustment, monitoring, any of that. So I think a lot of people struggle with that if they haven't had enough experience in one of those realms. So if you haven't been a coach, if you haven't been a scientist, if you haven't lifted for a long time, I have a lot of people just right now who are like, hey, if there's no difference between high load and low load training, but in some studies, low load training, high reps causes more fatigue, why wouldn't you ever just train above 8 reps? And I'm like, let me click on your profile. Oh, I see. You're 22. Yes. So I see. You've never had tendonitis, right? You've never done leg extensions with trying to just do 4 to 6 RM for more than 3 weeks. You haven't trained for 20 years. And, if you coach, that probably the majority of your lifters who've been lifting for 10 years or longer, or have an age that starts with a 3 and is double digit, meaning you're not coaching 3-year-olds, that they're going to prefer higher reps on certain single joint movements, or at least need more warm-ups to do it. And if you tell them, hey, science says, 4 to 8 reps on everything, they're going to say, that feels terrible and it hurts, So if people don't have the certain experience or expertise, they can be sitting atop that Dunning-Kruger mountain and not really realize it, and to simply be kind of closing doors on options, which is never helpful for a lifter.
We're in an interesting time with social media and how so many people are taking their education from it, and from basically like sound bites. And then you've also got people who aren't maybe as well experienced and also educated in kind of reading science and then conveying that, using science as almost clickbait and to kind of get eyes on them and as like promotion and marketing and selling themselves. And then people are digesting that and people are getting fed up with it. People are interpreting it the wrong way. And so, yeah, when you talk through that, that's just where my mind goes, where people are just not, people are getting frustrated and other people are, not. This is why I've said it over the last few years, where I've taken more and more respect from wisdom and from people who have just been doing this a long time. So it makes me immediately think of someone like Jeff Alberts and what he talks about. I'm like, there's just so much value in someone who's been there, done that with lots of people, that you can't discount it. And obviously science gives us an additional great aspect of that. And I always come back to it because obviously this better than anyone, Eric. There's like this somewhat of a hate against science-based lifting and that sort of element. And I'm always like, I understand that because I think about evidence-based as bringing in that experiential element too. And people often who are, say they're science-based don't understand that part. And you kind of said to why, because they don't value that experience just yet. And they want to sound more educated or like beyond their years in terms of their experience level. I don't know. Just random thoughts that I'm spitballing at you.
No, I totally agree. And a lot of it too is that we have monkey brains, man. Like we weight things in emotional ways rather than logical ways. And we have to work very hard to try to approach things rationally. I mean, Steve, I know your brain works this way because mine does too, even though we're both interested in science. But like when you get someone on the podcast and they explain their rationale, why they do it, and they report to you that it works, and you've got pictures of them online, and you see that it did work, and if it, say, goes against something that might be science-based, you're like, wow, it's hard to argue with that, you know? And that's not a bad way of thinking, and that is a real thing that happened. But then you'll look at a study, and it doesn't feel real. But for me, who's actually conducted these studies, I'm sitting at this. I've met this person. There's that N of 20 is not just some concept. That's legitimately 20 people who we recruited, who I scanned their quadricep with an ultra. I didn't just look in the mirror and go, "Hey, I think this guy got bigger. I'm going to mark a bigger in this group." I did an ISAC anthropometry skin fold test on them. Right? We tested their 1RMs. I trained them for 3 times a week for 8 weeks. I met this person. They've told me about their kids and their job. They are just as real to the people who actually conducted that study as the person who is on that podcast. Yet you don't see that when you're someone who is hosting a podcast or looking at a social media post or following someone on YouTube. So when someone says, you know, all this science, but look at the real world in the trenches results, it doesn't make the same sense to someone who's actually conducted a study, because feels very similar, my experience when I run a training study, to when I used to be a personal trainer, to when I'm actually physically in the gym that I'm going to go to later today. These are real people experiencing real changes with much more sensitive, things. But at the same time, there are some people who respond completely differently than the rest. And I'm reporting a mean. And there may have been no one who got the mean response of a 10% increase in hypertrophy. It might have been a clustering of 12 and a clustering of 8, and one person got none, and one person got 30, and one person lost muscle, and that average was 10%. And I think those are concepts that are just so amorphous and very intangible, and they can't evoke the same emotional response as to when you see and hear about these anecdotes. So it's a difficult divide to cross when you have people who have a tremendous amount of experience in one realm and not the other. Because when a researcher's just like, no, that's not the way it happens, they're not just saying that because they've read a bunch of PDFs. They're saying that because they've been in the lab, studying people in multiple instances. But then again, if that person hasn't actually been training in the same way that bodybuilders do, or bodybuilding coaches do, or in that environment, or with that population, they can also have some biases. I listen to some people who talk about like, well, no one grows after this point, or I've never seen that outside this 12-week study, or this, that, and like, maybe you haven't coached a bunch of WNBF, like pro level competitors for 10 years. Maybe you haven't coached someone from their very first powerlifting meet to when they won IPF Worlds, so I think you really just have to maintain a level of humility that is almost unjustified if you haven't experienced one of the other things. So I really do get it too. I get annoyed, but I don't really fault the individuals. It is very hard in the current landscape to have a perspective that accurately captures what is going on in research, to understand those limitations, to understand how they apply, and then to also go, right, we're observing these real anecdotes. We can't necessarily nail down a mechanism, but that happened. That person achieves extremely high level outcome doing a very low volume protocol. or at least for a good chunk of their career. And I have to accept that that is true, as well as the meta regression, by Pelland. And I think a lot of people, like, I have no problem doing that, but I think a lot of people can't. Those seem, they have like they have to choose. Like those are diametrically opposed. Those two things can't exist in the same reality. So either the researchers are being paid off by big sets, which I still haven't found which company promotes sets, but they're, based upon some strange YouTube comments, there does seem to be an insidious plan to make people spend slightly longer in the gym. So I have to believe in some conspiratorial thing or biased researchers pushing agendas, even though these studies are being conducted on different continents, or I have to dismiss the anecdotes of the bodybuilder or just, poo-poo it. And neither one is the right response.
It reminds me of, I think it's a book. It's something along the lines of like, what you see is all there is. So like and I think about that sometimes where I'm like, am I just like, I don't know what the pill is. Like there's red pills, black pills, blue pills, whatever there is. The pill that means that I'm just like dogmatic in the evidence-based space and I love an Eric Helms because like science and research, but actually these guys like Eddie Abu, he's the guy who knows what he's doing. He got jacked and I'm just like indoctrinated. I like to think I'm in that more of like I don't know if the right term is like a Joe Rogan. He brings on loads of different opinions and he doesn't like abide by just the media and what they're putting out. And I try and bring on different voices. I won't just bring on any old person onto the podcast, though. I do like to bring on people that, even if they are just someone like Wesley Vissers, who came on, he listens actually to the podcast and he is paying attention to science, but also has his own anecdotes and experience there, which can be valuable at the same time. And it's just also weighting it. It's like, I always think about kind of the hierarchy of evidence. You can't put that one person's anecdote at the same level as like meta-analyses or meta-regressions. And I think some people don't understand that, or they're not willing to understand that. So yeah, it's a complicated time at the moment. I also heard you talking, I think it was with Eric Trexler not long ago, where there's kind of people talk about this big push for like, obviously length and partials are in vogue and kind of sexy, and I don't know, everyone's hearing about them, and then people say, oh yeah, people are just pushing them, they've got an agenda, whatever, and they name someone like a Milo Wolf. And I remember you saying, like, when I look at Milo's content and actually look at it, watch it, listen to it, he's like, yeah, it might be a small benefit to do it in these sort of situations, and names all these caveats. And it's scary because it's like old wives' tales that just get reported, like these little sound bites, and slowly people start believing it if they hear it enough. It's like, actually, it's just one person who has misinterpreted or misrepresented something. So I think that's happening a lot too. And it's scary because like some people aren't going to listen to the long format, and they just have this person they trust and will just listen to them as if they are always telling the truth. Whereas, I don't know, a lot of people, again, on social media are not out there trying to do good. They are just trying to sell something, maybe, even if that's just views.
No, 100%. We're controversy sells, and I as much as I really do think that the substance and the actual content that someone like Milo is putting out is an accurate representation, or at least a reasonable interpretation of the way he sees the data, and it's not hyperbolic when it really comes down to like the actual content if you listen through all of it. To some degree, I do think with the content posting schedule, the frequency, titles and thumbnails that are needed on YouTube, and also how one responds to controversy when it comes up, it is really challenging just not to get away from you. And I think if you asked Milo, like, hey, would you repeat, if you look back on the last 2 years of content you've made, would you change anything? He'd probably go, of course, like, we're still figuring this shit out. And I don't get it right. I know Milo doesn't think he gets it right. He's relatively humble when it comes to kind of assessing, what do I know, what don't I know, and what blind spots do I have, and what am I trying? And I think it is really a difficult space to operate in when you are trying to create a large platform, which is going to be scrutinized, and the intentions as to why you're trying to build that platform will be assumed. And depending upon someone's view of you and what they've heard, they will potentially assume malintent. not everyone operates by the principle of charity, which is I'm going to assume the most reasonable, rational, and good-willed version of why you're doing something until you prove me otherwise. And that burden of proof for some people is incredibly low, So a lot of people will definitely assign malintent trying to grow a platform. You're doing it to just sell MyoAdapt. Oh, you're doing it to just make money. You're doing it just because you like the clout. It's very reasonable as well for maybe a science communicator to want to grow a platform so that they can, I don't know, communicate science to people as well. And I think that should probably be the default assumption. Like, I'm not, like, people don't necessarily get insights into my day-to-day life very often. Like, if you pay attention, I'm on the internet a lot, but I'm a relatively private person when it comes to my personal life. I don't like that I have to be on the internet. I don't want fame. I have a mission. I have a mission to help elevate the sport that has been really, really beneficial for me, that I feel I owe a debt of gratitude to. And I believe that the science aspect of it, evidence-based practice, and a more holistic perspective, we promote at 3DMJ, has had an immeasurable benefit on me getting a positive experience with bodybuilding, where otherwise it could have been, like maybe neutral to negative in terms of the way it's often done, and it chews people up and spits them out, So because I want to try to elevate the space, I recognize that for me to be able to effectively communicate science, I have to be to some degree the dancing monkey. You've got to make things to some degree sexy. And where you draw that line in the sand is unclear, constantly changing. The algorithm adapts, and you will be misunderstood. You will be mischaracterized. You will be purposely taken out of context to promote someone else's agenda. You will be used as a lightning rod if it can get someone else more clicks and views. Simply reacting to your content is now gold these days. So if you decide to play the game and you go, you know what? I'm going to accurately communicate the science, but I'm also going to use every single tool that I know works to grow as fast as possible. It is going to result in a substantial amount of backlash. We see it against RP as it grows. We see it against Milo. We see it against PAC. I get it sometimes. And I probably am one of the more conservative and really, really unwilling to enter into drama and controversy because I feel it takes away from my credibility, my message, and the information. And it's so easy to make it about me. So, but I also grow slower than other people. There's a cost to that. Like when I get held up as here's the way you're supposed to do it, I go, you know what? I'm kind of the beneficiary of a following that I built in the pre-social media era. Like I hit 100,000 followers in 2019 on Instagram. Think of just how much has changed in terms of the social media game in the last 6 years. What I was doing to reach 100,000 followers does not work anymore. I know because I've seen these trash metrics and it's embarrassing. And people are like, oh, Eric, like, what did you do to build a following? Like, I don't know. Don't ask me. I was naked a lot in 2019. I competed, so people followed me, right? So the intentionality I have now, it is so focused on how do I grow at the fastest rate while not doing things I'm uncomfortable with or preserving this message. And it is where I've put my line in the sand, but it comes at substantial cost. I could make more money if I was maybe a little less risk averse, if I was more comfortable with people not liking me. Frankly, it's a personality thing. And you and I are similar. We're both, we don't like to be in interpersonal conflicts, right? We want the world to get along. We see the positives. And I think that is to my own sanctity and sanity, I couldn't operate in a space where I was constantly embroiled in these dramas. And the fact that some of the folks we're talking about can, and they can grow, and they can promote science, and maybe, they look to me and I provide a slightly more conservative version or a corrective element, it's very possible that we're better for both of us being in here with different personalities. One of my favorite conversations we've had on Iron Culture was when I brought Lane Norton on. And I basically told him, like, the way you do it is not the way I do it. I don't know if it's good. It's got pros and cons. And he was like, yeah, man, we're very different people. We do things differently. And, you're educating like other educators and trainers, and I'm just getting a message out to the masses. And I also, I get to dunk on the anti-science people, and people hate me for it, but others, I'd save them. And it's like there's many ways to try to accomplish the same mission, and I don't know the answer, but I will say that it is not an easy space to operate in. And the principle of charity is a guiding light that I think a lot of people really should use, not from just a being nice perspective, but it's probably the best way to get an idea of the truth. Because as much as there are a lot of crappy people in the world, at least in their own mind, they're still typically the heroes in their own story. And they think that at least what they're doing is positive. And there's very few people who look in the mirror and go, yep, let's go fleece some people for the dollar bills, with the fake science.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. Additionally, you get access to our exclusive Revive Stronger member site, where you'll be able to watch over hundreds of hours worth of educational content. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Again, well said. And I think what you mentioned there in terms of there being no kind of right way to communicate science and do this, and there's different people can take it on and others can't. I even know that difference between Milo and Pac, for example. Milo has been a little bit more controversial and he can take it. Or seemingly he can. I think he deals with it better, whereas Pac maybe not as much, and maybe Pac will grow thicker skin over time and decide to dip his toe in that. And it's like you said, very rightly put with regards to me. I've always said I've liked to be a bit more vanilla. I don't like the controversy. Whenever that has happened, I try and steer it a different way, a different direction. I try and bring people together versus make them kind of against one another. Remember you and Mike, at some point, people were putting you up against one another. I know you really dislike that kind of dynamic, but you also saw the benefits of how it can help get eyes and can grow things. And it's just balancing that and finding what suits you. I know a lot of coaches listen to this, so they appreciate your words on it and just recognizing, see what you're comfortable with. See what grows you at the amount that you're kind of happy with. I've certainly thought about it where I'm just like, hey, I might be able to be bigger and what have you in terms of, I don't know, income and like Revive Stronger as a whole, but how much would that take away from other things I enjoy? So I'm kind of like, I always try and pull it back to that. Anyway, we've gone down a bit of a route I didn't necessarily intend to, but I think it's very topical and I always enjoy these discussions. We have spoken about protein though. And you kind of highlighted it earlier that, and many will probably know, especially by the time this comes out, because this will come out a bit later, but you just popped a meta-analysis, in terms of protein intakes to retain fat-free mass along with Martin Refalo. So we definitely should touch on that. And then many people will be aware of that controversy between Menno and Milo, and just kind of to hear your input on that would be really useful. So why don't we start off with that meta-analysis, because I think there was some pretty high intakes that came out from that, potentially, where people, if they were to take it away and be like, oh man, I haven't been dieting on enough protein. Yeah.
This actually started during my 2023 prep. I remember very specifically, I was on a walk and I might have been either before where I won my pro card or Worlds. And I messaged Trexler and I said, hey man, I think we have enough data now to where we could potentially do a meta-analysis on the systematic review that I did back in 2013 that got full printed in 2014, where I postulated that higher protein intakes might be better, especially if you're lean and dieting and you're doing resistance training. Because that systematic review, while it had some quantitative values in it, it was very much limited. There was 6 total studies that met my inclusion criteria. And while I reported 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass is the recommendation, which is highly specific. And the reason why is it was literally just the ranges that were in the study groups from those 6 studies, the specific intervention groups, that were consumed in the groups that did not lose significant amounts of fat-free mass, had no change in fat-free mass, or actually gained fat-free mass during the course of those studies. So it's like a semi-quantitative systematic review. But importantly, only 2 of those studies were actually interventions where they compared them. Like, we are operationally interested in changes in fat-free mass, and the independent variable that we're manipulating is going to be protein intake and their dieting, right? And their resistance training, and they're not lean. Now, you said meta-regression. Hold on, wait, a meta-analysis. Basically, any type of statistical assessment of a large scale could be considered a meta-analysis. So you're not wrong either way. What we ended up doing was actually a meta-regression. Meta-analysis is a technique where typically what you're doing is a categorical comparison. You go, all right, higher protein, lower protein, but you might have some groups that their lower protein intake is closer to the higher protein intake in another group. You do some weighted mean averages, you get a statistical comparison, etc. So our intention was in this one that we just published, which was led by Dr. Martin Refalo, because, the funny thing, I texted Trex and he was like, yeah, that sounds great. I agree. I have no time. And I was like, well, neither do I. I was hoping we could split the load. And he was like, I don't think splitting is enough. And we thought, who we should reach out to? Martin. He's just an incredibly efficient worker. He's coming up to the end of his PhD. For those who don't know, he did a fantastic job out of Deakin University. I had the pleasure of being part of his team, primarily led by Jackson Fife as well as Lee Hamilton, and he did some of the most seminal work on training to failure. He did a fantastic study. I know you've talked about it here on Revive Stronger, and Martin has developed some really good statistical chops. So he's the lead author on this. He did the lion's share of the work. So we reached out to Martin, and now we had someone who actually had a little more time and willingness to really kind of carry the ball over the end zone than myself or Trex. And we did intend to do a proper categorical meta-analytic comparison between higher versus lower protein intakes. But there were only, I think, 5 or 6 studies which met the inclusion criteria. And we went, you know what? We're not confident in that analysis. We decided that's just a little bit short of what we would want to do. So we only did a meta-regression. Now, a meta-regression is a meta-analytic technique, but what it specifically does is it looks at the relationship between 2 variables while accounting for a lot of other factors, just like the meta-regression on volume that Palina did that we were talking about earlier, or Robinson and colleagues with RIR and hypertrophy in both cases. But the meta-regression we did, it includes all studies where we could extract changes in fat-free mass or lean body mass. We could extract the body composition and that met the inclusion criteria, and we could also extract their protein intake, right? So this is a higher quality of evidence than just a simple systematic review where you're kind of just doing, say, vote counting, or just kind of assessing the broad literature qualitatively and my interpretation of it. The meta-regression does give you an actual estimation, and you can model a relationship between 2 variables, but it is to some degree not as high of a quality of evidence as a meta-analysis with a categorical comparison. Because when you do a meta-analysis, the categorical comparison, you're saying this is only the RCTs, or at least controlled trials, where what they're experimentally manipulating is protein, and the outcome we care about is fat-free mass. The meta-regression is saying, hey, we're going to try to account for as many variables possible: sex, age, resistance training, body fat percentage, length of the deficit, size of the deficit, you name it. And we're going to look at how much of the variance was explained by our variables of interest. But this might have been a study on intermittent fasting. It might have been a study on volume, and they just happened to be in a deficit, and we had 2 different protein intakes in groups or whatever. If we can get the data and we can look at the relationship, we can summarize it. So the good news is we're looking at hundreds upon hundreds of people. We've got dozens of studies, and this is the highest quality data that exists now on protein intake in a deficit, but it doesn't have that really robust categorical, only the RCTs kind of comparison. So we're still describing this as exploratory, but it's absolutely a step up from, say, my 2014 systematic review, which I think has probably been oversighted just because it's me, to be honest. I don't say that out of arrogance. I say that it's kind of unfortunate, that Eric Helms proved we need a higher protein intake. It's like, more like I observed in these 6 studies that higher protein intakes were associated with better lean mass retention. So we're a step closer now. Now we're looking at hundreds rather than dozens of people, and we've got dozens of studies. And what we found in this meta regression was that in people who were not obese, so we used some operational cutoffs for body fat percentage to be included, who were performing resistance training, who were dieting for at least 2 weeks, but of course we did categorical, or rather sub-analyses on longer dieting periods, who were in a deficit, which we objectively quantified by what was the actual energy value of body composition change. Not what was the intended deficit or surplus, but did we see changes in fat mass and lean mass, and was that a net energy deficit, right? Or if it wasn't, if it was neutral or a surplus, not included in our study, regardless of what the intention was, what was this relationship? And we had values all the way from 1 gram per kilogram of protein all the way up to 3.2 grams per kilogram of protein. And when we extracted it as grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, we had it all the way from, I believe, 0.9 or maybe 1 all the way up to 4.2. So we did multiple types of model fitting to see what fit the data best, what best explained the data without overfitting it, trying to find something nice and harmonious. And we found that there was a slightly better fit when using fat-free mass. It explained with 99% confidence that there seemed to be an actual just linear dose response between protein and fat-free mass. And it was linear as well for grams per kilogram intakes, but the confidence interval just barely crossed over 0. So we had like 97% certainty versus 99% when we looked at fat-free mass. Now, anytime I say there's a linear dose response between lean body mass, and protein intake, it's very important to talk about the magnitude. And it's very important to explain why is there this controversy right now between, say, Menno's interpretation of the protein data and Milo's, right? And I think it's primarily one of magnitude, and it does come back to sampling variance. So if you look at our linear relationship, there's 2 main components. There is the confidence that we have in the relationship and the magnitude of the effect. Like I said, we have a 99% confidence in the grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. So this is a real thing. But the effect size is only 0.06 for every single 1 gram per kilogram of fat-free mass increase in protein. So what that means is that as you go from 1 gram per kilogram of fat-free mass up to 2 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, it is 1/3, slightly less than 1/3 of a small effect. So you have to go all the way from like 1 to like 3.5-ish grams per kilogram of fat-free mass before you get what we would describe as a small effect. So this is marginal changes in lean body mass. And this is something I've said for a very long time, is that protein does absolutely have a positive effect on muscle growth or muscle retention, depending upon the context. But it really does pale in comparison to the importance of, say, resistance training or the size of your deficit or surplus. Now, so overall, what were our findings? I'll just use the grams per kilogram findings because I think it's a little clearer and it's numbers that people don't have to convert in their head. Right around the 1.9 grams per kilogram point is where, if you look at our slope, it hits the no loss or no change in fat-free mass. So that's kind of cool. So depending upon your context, if you're just someone who's dieting, you're not a professional bodybuilder, and you're like, listen, well, I don't want to lose lean mass while dieting, a decent rule of thumb is 2 grams per kilogram of protein, right? Which is very in line with what we talked about before. And if you're someone who's just like, well, that's a lot for me, and I want to lose mostly fat mass, but I'm also just a casual dieter. I'm like, you know what? Don't worry about it. 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, it's going to mitigate, in most cases, the vast majority of lean mass losses. And if you're actually doing an effective training program, it might mitigate all of it. Because again, this is not a trend line that assumes perfect resistance training. It's an aggregate of all the things that can affect lean body mass, like we talked about earlier with the Pell and meta regression. And then it keeps going up. So after 1.9 grams per kilogram of protein per day based upon total body mass, you start to actually see gains on average in the studies. And those go all the way up to the highest value that we analyzed of 3.2. We did try fitting other model types where it could potentially observe a diminishing returns or a plateau And if you recall back to the prior meta-analyses, probably the most well-cited one by Morton and colleagues, which again is probably most well-cited because of all the authors who were on it. You know, you had Alan Aragon, you had Menno, you had me. Again, I've seen some really funny positioning. Like people have talked about the Tagawa meta-regression being this obscure paper that no one knew about. And I'm like, no, it was a well-cited, up-to-date meta-analysis. It's just that it's a circle jerk of fitness professionals who are also scientists. Why Morton is being cited because it has famous people on it. Like, I'll just say it, I'm one of them, right? So it is not the most up-to-date one. Morton is out of date, and there has been multiple meta-regressions and meta-analyses since it. I don't cite Morton anymore. I haven't cited Morton since, Tagawa and I think and Nunes came out in 2022. They're more up-to-date. They have more studies included. And the breakpoint analysis we did, yeah, it breaks around 1.62, but if you actually look at that graph, it's break-ish, And if we look at the confidence, how much certainty do we have around 1.6? It spanned from 1 gram per kilogram all the way to 2.2 grams per kilogram. And you're like, well, that's not helpful, Eric. Like, you're telling me the optimal intake is somewhere between 1 gram per kilogram and 2.2? But hopefully, it makes sense now that I've explained how small the effect size is of protein. Yeah, 3 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass is a better protein intake than 1, but it'll have a small effect. And I think that's just something that we have to accept. On average, obviously that's not in the context of a bodybuilding prep, but for the average person dieting, eating a whole lot of protein will be beneficial, but only to a small effect. And that is where sampling variance comes into this. Menno rightly stated in his kind of critique of, I believe, Milo's interpretation of the protein data that we've never seen a study where you compare high to moderate protein intakes, and I'll categorize that as, say, over 2 grams per kilogram compared to something in the range of 1.3 to 1.7, right, to outperform it, at least to a significant degree. That is true. And at least to my knowledge, maybe there's a few studies that I've missed, or at least there's probably a handful at best that have actually significantly shown an outcome in favor of higher protein intakes. What's also true, however, is I'm only aware of one single study that has ever been published across hundreds where a low protein intake significantly outperformed a higher protein intake. But there are hundreds of studies where higher protein intakes outperform a lower protein intake. It's just when you get to very high protein intakes, you really start to not see any more of these significant differences. And this is exactly what you would predict if we saw a diminishing returns effect of higher protein intakes, that the higher you went, the less you get out of it, these marginal gains. And this has been observed in more robust ways than the breakpoint analysis in Morton. Tagawa actually had a pretty cool analysis where they looked at basically the slope. How vertically inclined is the line between protein intake and changes in fat-free mass, with it being more vertically inclined, meaning, okay, I'm accelerating gains in fat-free mass to a faster degree with the higher protein intake. And there is a steeper slope indicating a better return per unit of protein as an investment on your lean body mass, up to 1.3 grams per kilogram. And then it really flattens out. And you have to go all the way from 1.3 to something closer to 2 or 3 grams per kilogram before you're potentially getting a benefit. That's another way of kind of showing that breakpoint. And the breakpoint by Tagawa, that's 1.3-ish. Nunes and colleagues, 2022, which I think is probably the most up-to-date, best meta-regression and meta-analysis that we have on this. And people don't actually look at the supplementary files to look at the actual meta-regression. They just read the abstract, of course. And if they do read the full text, then you still got to click on the supplementary files. You check out figure S12. That's that's the deep cuts for people who really want to learn this stuff. That is where you can see this again, because they did a categorical meta-analytic comparison, and they did find that when they compared, so I think it was 1.2 to 1.59 gram per kilogram intakes, there was a positive effect. I think it was like a trivial effect, less than 0.2, but it was a slightly higher one when you compared 1.6 or higher. So it's kind of supporting the Morton meta-analysis findings. But they also did a meta-regression. And when you look at the meta-regression, you can see it's linear. And it doesn't really clearly taper. The uncertainty does increase. And if you look at the actual number of study groups on that line, figure S12, check it out, folks. That's the lean body mass effects and those who are doing resistance training during the controlled trial. you can kind of see that somewhere between like 2 to 3 grams per kilogram protein intakes, that's where you stop getting more data and you're looking just a few data points and the uncertainty starts to increase. And I think that's like a decent perspective on the whole thing. You know, Nunez has found that. We found a linear dose response relationship, but the magnitudes are so small that it is probably not going to make much of a difference. So then it becomes context dependent. How easy for you in terms of cost, digestive comfort, personal preference as far as your nutrition, and your goals? Are you willing to invest another, $30 on your grocery bill to maybe 10 years from now have an additional 100 grams of lean tissue? Most bodybuilders would be like, absolutely, but I think most people would be like, I'm not going to major in the minors here. And you shouldn't, but it's very difficult to communicate that. People struggle with not viewing things in black and white manner. So my overall take on this debate is that I think there has been a misrepresentation of the science. Morton is being oversighted. It is like, most research doesn't expire. Meta-analyses do, because they're summarizing prior research. So you want to use the most up-to-date, well-done meta-analysis. I also think some of the shots that are being taken at the Tagawa meta-analysis are just wrong. You're saying, it included studies with, an energy deficit that totally throws off the results. Well, they included body weight. And I think that probably corrects for that quite well. But more importantly, Tagawa is also 5 years old. We have a more up-to-date meta-analysis, and we're going to keep having them. So use the most up-to-date one. And there's a really good article on Stronger by Science right now by Greg Nuckols, where he kind of walked through all of this. And I generally agree with pretty much everything that was stated in that article. And I think what I really like about that article is that Greg takes a perspective on, hey, here's our more conservative view of where the highest benefit you might get is, and here's the more aggressive view. Like, I really want to make sure I get everything. And it does kind of basically, once again, sit in that range of like 2 to 3 grams per kilogram of protein, slightly lower. So protein is, I think arguing about protein is definitely minoring in the majors, but it is good to know the actual relationship. And some interesting stuff about our findings were that when we did sub-analyses, they strengthened our confidence. So the longer the length of deficit, the more robust that relationship became, which tells us we're not looking at short-term artifacts of water weight changes. You look at a 2-week study, even with DEXA, I'm not super confident we're actually looking at true, like, quote unquote, lean mass changes, right? We've got studies where you have people go in with an empty stomach or not empty stomach, and it changes their scan results. Another thing that we found that gave us some confidence is that the strength of those findings also increased the leaner someone was. So when we looked at women under 20% body fat and men under 12% body fat, protein seemed to have a more notable effect than a deficit for preserving lean mass and potentially even increasing it. So these things all make sense from a mechanistic perspective as well. When you get someone who's leaner and leaner and leaner and you put them in total starvation, you see divergent responses to someone who has overweight or obesity. You take men with obesity, you put them on total starvation, and you see sometimes increases in testosterone, and you don't necessarily see changes in their utilization of amino acids for energy. But if you take a lean male, they'll typically have a decrease in testosterone. You'll see 2 to 3-fold increases in leucine oxidation, a doubling of gluconeogenesis, where they're actually converting protein energy into something that they can use into carbohydrates or breaking it down to get the ketones out of it. And you don't see that in people with obesity. So when you have someone who does not have as much adipose tissue to mobilize and you starve them, they're more likely to have to use protein from their body. And when we look at another type of study entirely, muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown studies, we see divergent responses when you have people in normal body composition ranges, quote unquote normal, or people who are with obesity or with overweight. You see a suppression of muscle protein synthesis in those studies in people with overweight or obesity and no change in muscle protein breakdown. But in 2 studies, we've observed muscle protein breakdown goes up and MPS is capped, or at least is suppressed, when you take people in a more kind of lower body fat percentage and you put them into a deficit acutely. So you kind of get hit on both sides of the equation the leaner you get. And this also backs up what we see anecdotally. You as a coach, you as an athlete, probably, like, what you don't want is fast weight loss when you're like already shredded. And that looks bad after like 2 weeks. And sometimes even if after you fill out, you realize you couldn't fully recover from it. Like, oh shit, I actually lost some muscle there. And you have to be very careful in these divisions where you're trying to get really lean, especially with athletes who don't have quite as much muscle mass, tend to flatten out easily. And it's critical that they, maintain all their muscle mass. You don't want to see, even I would argue, like 0.5 to 1% of body weight loss, even though that's kind of like quote unquote evidence-based gold standard. On average, yes. But towards the end of a prep, I want to see less than 0.5%, or they are looking worse, So there's a lot of things that line up, whether they're acute mechanistic data or anecdotes or the actual meta-regression we just published, that do seem to indicate, some of this stuff does make sense, but the effects are not large. So sampling variance is kind of it is the source of most disagreements that we see between the scientific community and non-scientists and their confusion. And it's also the source of most disagreement between people in the scientific community. Because where we don't have robust consensus-based data, or we can make interpretations that are quite similar, that's where we disagree, because it's open for interpretation. And I think protein intake is just like length and partials and just like volume are great examples where once we are taking an otherwise pretty good program, training close to failure, and we just go, I'm going to emphasize the length and position of this already decent exercise, we should only expect small effects. Once we're comparing moderately high protein intakes to high protein intakes in an otherwise good situation for muscle growth, we should only expect small effects. Once we're comparing 10 to 20 sets to 20 to 30 sets in an otherwise good program that's producing hypertrophy, we should only expect small effects. And when we're sampling only 10 to 20 people at a time in each one of these groups, we should expect to see the majority of the findings be null, occasionally tip the wrong way, occasionally greatly exaggerate the effects of protein, length and partials, or volume. But on average, once we actually get enough studies to aggregate it, we will see the signal and the noise. But what the issue is right now is with the content treadmill that we're all on, is that anytime a new length and partial study, protein study, or volume study, or insert whatever is hot right now comes out, we're getting this whiplash effect of we're just focusing on what recently came out. Oh my God, dumbbell lateral raises produce the same amount as a cable lateral raise? Lengthened bias training in shambles. Wait, oh my God, incline curls produce better biceps growth, but preacher curls produce better brachialis growth? Lengthened bias training is the bomb. It's always right. Oh my God, new length and partial study. It went the other way. I'm in shambles again. This flip-flopping, screw science, right? And you can see it online in these comments. And people are hanging their hat on single studies because we're making content every time a single study comes out. And I think that is one thing that I'm pretty confident is a bad thing. Like, yeah, I get it. We need to promote science. So when science comes out, we need to talk about it. And we can have these thumbnails, we can have these hyperbolic titles. But if we don't do some education as to understanding to some degree the meta science or the philosophy of the science, people are going to feel like science is just flip-flopping. And I can't trust this stuff. You guys can't make up your mind. When in actuality, if you understood the hierarchy of evidence, if you understood the simple concept, and I say simple as kind of an arrogant asshole, the semi-simple concept, if it well explained to you and you understand probabilistic thinking and statistics of sampling variance, this stuff makes a ton of sense. And it's literally exactly what you would predict if you expected each one of these things, once you got into the higher ranges of protein, the higher ranges of volume, and kind of a maximizing semi-decent exercises already to be slightly better, you would expect trivial to small positive effects. And that is very well represented by the data we're seeing in aggregate. If I was to tell you that, hey, we've got about 50 studies that are either looking at isometrics at longer lengths versus shorter lengths, partials at shorter lengths versus longer lengths, exercises that have a better resistance profile at longer lengths versus worse, or exercises which stretch a biarticular muscle or don't. About half the time we see a small beneficial effect, half the time we see null, and we've seen no negatives going the other way, where shortened training was better. And you would say, well, that's really unclear. And I'd say, no, that's perfectly representative of a small positive effect in aggregate. And that's the way we need to view it. But that's a hard that's a hard view to have. First, you have to stay up to date with all of the research, which I do, but other people have lives. And then you have to have the probabilistic understanding of it. And what ends up happening instead is you're aware of some of the studies because you're following science communicators reporting about them, which isn't going to be a complete overview. And then even if you're like good at this stuff and maybe you're following a decent science communicator, what you're doing is you're digging into the methods. And now you're trying to explain each time you have a neutral or a positive or a null. And sometimes, the methods will tell you why that happened. But sometimes it's just because Susie was stressed that week. And even though she was in the seated hamstring curl group, she didn't make much progress because she was so stressed and she wasn't sleeping. And it could have been the tempo that they used on the eccentric, or it was because Susie was stressed, Tom wasn't eating enough, and Jim actually barely made enough of the sessions. He hit the 80% cutoff, and then the average in the other group was slightly higher completion rates. I don't know. All this stuff, there's a ton of things that happen, but it could just be random chance. It could be sampling variance attributed to those clusters of things because we only had 8 to 10 people in each group. So it's not easy, Steve.
There's a lot there. And this actually brings me back to something I spoke to Max Coleman about. And I don't know if you've heard of this, but I first heard of this model from Alan Aragon. It's called the bead model of truth. It's actually from Dr. Littleton. Have you heard of it?
I have not. So you've engaged my interest.
So basically, you imagine a bead on a horizontal wire. The bead can move left to right on that wire. On the far left is the number which corresponds to total disbelief. On the far right is on the right-hand side of the wire is number 1, which is related to the position of total belief, or where you could believe in the claim or absolute certainty. So it's like, on this wire, where's the bead? Is it how much do we believe this? Whatever, length and partials are the way to go for hypertrophy. How much do we disbelieve it? And I always think of this bead model of truth whenever I heard that, like a decade ago from Alan Aragon, and he presented it in terms of when evidence comes in, you put it on the bead. Does it nudge you in a certain direction versus every time you're on like a new bead of like absolute certainty or absolute disagreement? So it's very much like that whiplash effect, but like rather than pushing you in one way or the other, it's just nudging our confidence in a certain thing. So like the volume research, the more and more that comes out, it's like nudge us towards that dose response relationship, or like with, you said, the training studies on length and bias training or what have you. It's just kind of giving us that understanding. And I also think about that when you talk through this in terms of like, high protein, like if people were just to dumb it down, high protein's better, higher volume's better, like length and partials or like a long muscle length. It's like the bodybuilders knew what they were doing, right? And in some sense that's true. And I think of that in regards to what you said there, where like people were growing and were huge and have been for a long time. If there was something to come out that was just completely game changing, I mean, they probably already be somewhere close to it. So it makes sense in my eyes, at least, that science is only giving us like a slightly refined approach, or is giving us a better understanding of why did they do that in the past. But it's unlikely to completely change the face of no one study is going to come out over the next decade. It's going to be like, oh, we're training completely wrong. We should kind of do this other thing that we'd never thought of doing. That's at least the way I think about it.
No, I agree. I think some things can't survive anecdotes. Some anecdotes can't survive if they're wrong in especially a competitive environment. So things that can really, think of it this way. Success leaves clues, right? There's a reason that saying is not success leaves answers. And what we can know is that if a large enough proportion of highly successful bodybuilders are doing X, Y, and Z, that X, Y, and Z hasn't prevented their success. We can't know for sure if X, Y, and Z caused their success, but they didn't get in the way of it. Now, the nature of sport, anything competitive, is that, and even natural selection, if you want to think about this from a big term perspective, there are going to be some things that we don't need that didn't get in the way, that selection pressure allowed to get here, like your appendix. We don't, you can take that out, you'll be all right. If it bursts, it's a problem. But we don't necessarily need that for survival, just like many beliefs that bodybuilders have about things they must do have been chipped away at, and we've let go of them. I have to eat every 2 hours. I have to consume 2 grams per pound of protein. These are things that aren't going to prevent you from succeeding. And they've taken something that is semi-true, like we probably want to at least have 3 protein boluses. You probably want to have at least, say, 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein. And they went, all right, well, let's just turn that dial all the way up, see if I can get the most marginal gains out of it. And in some cases, there will be additional marginal gains. But a lot of the time, Steve, as we know from having been around in the game a long time, we're doing basically these rituals. Like for the sun to come up every day, I have to pray to the sun god. And everyone prays to the sun god, and the sun always comes up. That is also a very similar characterization of some of the things that get entrenched in a culture, right? And that's what we need to be wary of when we just rely on anecdotes, because you can believe certain things must be necessary for things to occur, and they might have neutral to negative effects that don't actually prevent you from succeeding. They might alienate you from your family. They might make it a lot less fun. They might make you burn out in 5 years. They might really have some harm after your competitive season is over, and these changes in sport, if there is not a scientific approach, which is really just observation and controlled, doesn't actually require like PubMed. You can have very scientific approaches to coaching, as we've talked about many times. These things help to weed out the chaff. And there's only so many things we can focus on. And if we're bending our will towards only eating, sweet potatoes, white rice, 2 other foods, and eating every 2 hours, that does take away from other things. And I will point out that refinement does have measurable effects. And if we look at what is going on currently in the IPF, what does the typical highest level, we're talking top 5 IPF world powerlifter do? Many times they have velocity trackers. They typically have a nutritionist who has a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or higher in nutrition. They're doing weight cutting strategies that are actually informed by research. If we look at cyclists and what allowed, say, Team GB to be really, really successful in a highly competitive environment, they had a team of sports scientists. When we look at elite sport where small differences do matter, and being bogged down by some of these traditional practices that at least split your attention and don't give you any benefit, but do get in the way, this is where the boundaries are starting to be pushed and where we are seeing athletes push things further and further. And this is also happening in bodybuilding, just a little bit slower. It's a niche sport, performance is subjective, all these things. So not everyone necessarily needs to be a WNBF top level pro competitor, or an IFBB pro competitor, to where they need to have this mindset of how do I incorporate science. If you're just looking to grow, lose some fat, be healthy, then you can get really far with the surface level understanding of these things. Like, yeah, what's a moderate protein intake that's going to be good enough? Okay, what's a moderate volume that's going to be good enough? What's a moderate protein frequency? Okay, what exercises are probably just a bad idea? Like what are some shortened, biased, poor exercises? Like, but what's going to be an effective use of my time? And sometimes us as content producers, you and I are competitive bodybuilders who are obsessed with this. Our audience is that a lot, but I have to remind myself that 70% of the people who listen to me, because we polled 3DMJ, don't compete, So we have to sprinkle in a little bit of this, because a lot of people who are not, frankly, shouldn't be putting in the same degree of obsessive single-mindedness towards a task are taking inspiration and information from us. So if we only give kind of the maximalist message, they can, ironically, due to science, be doing a lot of unnecessary things for what they want to get out of it. When, like you so eloquently stated, the purpose of science is to help us remove some of these unnecessary practices that just make it harder. Now, there are some times where actively harmful things do hang on, and it's because they become like a cultural attachment. Like very, very high frequency training or not training to failure. There are so few bodybuilders that actually do that, that like no one is promoting training at a 5 RIR, right? Or promoting training every muscle group every single day, at least not in the mainstream. There's some pockets. So how do we actually get exposure to that? And this is something I thought about and I learned from history. There were a lot of that stuff that I'm talking about was tried at a time when there was more unification in the iron game, when bodybuilders were still weightlifters, you know. But as we became more siloed, the perspective on what is, say, high frequency or high volume is drastically different between powerlifters, weightlifters, strongmen, and bodybuilders. And, when you get a certain very dogmatic camp, like I think the high intensity training kind of crew that grew out of Arthur Jones and Mike Menser, and I don't mean anyone who likes lower volume, high intensity. I'm not taking shots at like Dorian Yates. It's a much more reasonable version of that. But if you really take a look at like, I'm only doing one set to failure and anything more than that is dumb every 2 weeks for each muscle group. Like that is patently worse, very obviously false, easily falsifiable, but it holds on quite strongly because it has this controversial message, and it does have these figureheads, and those types of things can take hold. And then people are talking about like, man, I won't even mow the lawn in the week after my leg day. Cause I mean, you can't recover from that. And I'm like, the level of cognitive dissonance you have to kind of believe that people can't recover from one set to failure. It's like, how would we be walking today? How do we ever get across the plains of Africa if one set to failure without necessarily having, an entire meal and a complete week of rest afterwards? How does CrossFit exist? Why don't the people just explode, So some things can, if they have enough social hook, hang on for a while. And especially when they rely on things like the placebo belief or kind of having these godlike figures. I think a great example is if we didn't have research, think about the number of supplements that people would be taking, right? Because it's just a supplement company saying stuff, claiming things, taking, data out of context. And I do think if you were to just have a completely unregulated supplement industry, which we have had at different times, especially look at the US, and you were to take everything that had a potential neutral to positive effect, you might actually have a net negative effect because of some of the potential contaminants and things that are in there. And you would probably fail a drug test as a natural bodybuilder without actually getting a benefit or even getting a harm. So there are times when it is absolutely true to say, listen, we don't and we never have needed sports science to get people jacked. They've been getting jacked since the dawn of time. If we want to get them jacked with less mental cost, less societal cost, with having more time, more flexibility, and especially if we want to refine the outcomes. Like there's a reason why you could get a pro card just by having striated glutes in 2005. But in 2025, if you show up to a pro qualifier with striated glutes, congratulations, you've probably cracked the top 3 to 5 at a big show. And now do you have amazing genetics? Okay, now we're at top 3. All right, now are you big and did you capitalize on those genetics? Okay, now, so long as some other freak did show up, you might get a pro card. If not, well, do another show next weekend. And a huge component to that is because we literally didn't understand energy balance, macronutrient intakes, basic flexible dieting concepts 20 years ago. And not only that, we were vehemently pushing back against them. So all of this like hanging on rituals that didn't actually benefit bodybuilders technically didn't get in the way of success, but absolutely did serve as like these drag weights on the overall sports progression. If we think of it as like a ship, like, you got these fishing lines and a bunch of junk is hanging off and you can't get up to full speed. And now we have amateurs looking like pros. And it's not just because more people are competing. It's because people know how to get shredded. People know how to train effectively. I mean, I know I'm sounding like an old man, but when I first started promoting this stuff, I would have to get in fights about the concept of progressive overload. And I'd be like, listen, I'm not a power lifter. And I'm like, I'm not saying your 1RM needs to go up. And I would get in fights with the idea that you could have something besides brown colored portions of carbs, right? Or orange if you're allowed to have sweet potatoes. And then you ask them why is it that a russet potato is worse than a sweet potato? And they would tell me, shut up, small guy, right? So it was really not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago. But I think people forget where we were and where we've come. And now that we are chipping away at fewer things and we're sometimes focusing on marginal, trivial, positive effects that aren't relevant for a lot of people, it's just like, what's the point of this? Like, we already knew all that shit. And that's a good problem to have, because it means we have effectively diminished some of these really pervasive myths that were actually dragging us down. And yeah, now we're getting to turn over smaller stones. They don't have as large of an effect. And we have that social media nonsense that is making it all seem much more amplified and much more important than it actually is. And we're still figuring that out. So I get it. People are frustrated.
So well said. I can just think about my own journey within this space, even because for me, it was a case of I got into bodybuilding. It was like good and bad foods, and I was getting burnt out. I remember my mum said she was worried about me. She was going to get me like consulted with a doctor because I was essentially orthorexic at some point where I was just really obsessed. I was taking Tupperware to like family events, all of this. But once I stumbled upon flexible dieting, I think it was Alan Aragon, Lyle McDonald, first of all, and then I got exposed to like Matt Ogus and obviously you guys at 3DMJ. And it just gave me so many options, and it started to become a lifestyle. And I think you can use science really positively to continue now, like we do, to excite us and to give us new thoughts and ideas to encourage us to keep going, because gains at this point are pretty slow. Or you can get confused and bogged down with it. And so I do view that in how I try and convey and talk about science and how it can benefit us, to always remind and pull back to like that bigger picture, take perspective, don't get lost in kind of one study. And then a lot of my clients are those people that are excited by it, but some of them do need to pull back. Like, and I encourage that too, where I'm just like, you're investing too much into the little things that ultimately we're really not sure about. Pull back, and then they start enjoying it more, because as you put in the muscle and strength pyramids, which I'm going to promote at this point, because the 3rd edition I know is coming out very soon. Well, like, ref yourself in terms of like making it realistic, enjoyable, make it fun. Like that, again, hardcore bodybuilders like to poo-poo it, but it's so vitally important to kind of do that. And again, that might be the way that you consume scientific information or not, and how you incorporate it into your programming. So yeah, so many things in this chat, Eric, that I've really enjoyed, and I could keep talking to you for far too long, but I need a protein serving and some bedtime at some point, and I need you to go and get your second training session in. I know I just talked about the muscle and strength pyramids. Do you have a date for when they're now going to be due? Because I believe they're going to come out this year, right? The new
Definitely
updated version, that is.
Yeah, I can predict when I'll finish writing them, but I can't predict when we're finished doing all the figures, tables, copy editing, uploading, converting to Kindle format, all that good stuff. So the training pyramid is fully written, which is pretty cool. Like, I know all the updates in it, and that's very exciting. And that was almost a complete rewrite. So much data has come out. There is a tremendous modification to the exercise selection chapter. There's a lot more nuance in the volume and intensity and frequency chapter, which is now actually the training dose chapter, primarily focused on volume and intensity, with much less emphasis on frequency based upon some of these recent meta regressions. But yeah, a lot of the classic content's still there. Like you said, ref yourself, realistic, enjoyable, and flexible. Kind of having those concepts is
not fun.
Well, hey, fun, enjoyable is they're together. But yeah, we got a lot of stuff like that. I have another fun acronym in the exercise selection for hypertrophy principles, plate, which is a fun one, like a weight plate. But you've got that I can't remember what the acronym is now. This is going to be embarrassing.
People have to buy the book. There you go.
There you go. That was totally intentional. I definitely did not forget my own acronym. It's going to piss me off. But yeah, I'm not going to remember it now off the top of my head. So we're just going to cut this out, team. But anyway, the 3rd edition is coming out soon. It'll probably be somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd quarter because of the lag time for all that other stuff. But yeah, the nutrition updates are what I'm working on next. It's much more of an update, like kind of stuff we talked about in the protein range. It's not a massive difference to what I said. But some of the bigger changes are better ways to still hit all of your nutrient targets while having more flexibility. I think that's something that has evolved, which again is, as we've both experienced personally in our lives. I mean, shit, man, I used to be afraid of combining carbohydrates and fat in my first prep in the same meal.
Yeah.
If we really want to talk about old school myths, that is something that is ever evolving and improving for the nutrition books, but big changes in the training books. Absolutely. So yeah, I'm excited for it. Yeah, they will be coming out relatively soon.
It's been 6 years now since the second edition. They were 2019. So a lot has happened in 6 years. And so I'm excited to get those because, yeah, whenever I find myself, I don't know, at times I'm like, oh, I want some inspiration, but I also want to kind of, yeah, just like revisit some things. I walk through and read them. And not only is there great information like you would expect from a textbook, but it's just written in a very digestible, helpful way that is also very practically applicable, which I really, really enjoy. So I know we actually spoke about some of the updates to the nutrition side where it's like setting minimums for many of these things and giving much more flexibility. And I love things like that because, again, that's something I can incorporate into my own coaching. So I think these, again, a lot of the people listening will be practitioners themselves. So there's going to be stuff in there that you're going to be able to apply to your clients. If you haven't already bought it, I imagine the majority of the listeners, I hope, have already got them. And so they're probably going to get an automated update with it. So that's exciting. Is there anything else you've got going on your end apart from obviously the mass research review, the Through the MJ podcast and everything that you guys are doing over there?
The main thing is that I obsessively had to go look up what plate stood for. But
I'm glad I gave you time.
Yeah, thank you. Like I have some principles of hypertrophy exercise selection, and one of them is feasibility. Like I talk about, yes, you probably want to train them at a long length when possible and also provide load there. You need to have it sufficiently stable and a few other things. But then I was like, listen, let's talk about feasibility. You know, the citation is common sense, right? And I gave a really good acronym of PLATE. Is the exercise painful? Is it loadable? Is it available? Is it time efficient? And is it enjoyable? And if any of those things is not, if it's true or not the case, then don't chase down the science-based thing. Because it's going to be a net negative, which kind of comes back to some of the stuff we talked about. So, yeah, I had to correct the record there because I couldn't stand not remembering it. But that's it. I like man.
That. It's very similar to the ref yourself, and it's something I appreciate from you, Eric. Is you talk about the extremes of like maximizing and being this pro bodybuilder, and at that one of the extreme without losing touch with actually these other things that are actually vitally important. That if you can combine those two, great, but don't think you have to follow Eric's program always. It's very specific to you. So yeah, thank you so much, Eric, for taking the time and being here. We'll have to make it not 9 months again. I'll definitely get you on this year again. If anything, to talk about how prep is and everything is going, because that's going to be exciting. Are you vlogging the majority of it?
That's the plan. I plan on doing another. I think it won't be the last episode of Believe. I decided to call what I just did the last episode of Believe, post mini cut, because now it's just like, okay, I'm going to be gaining for 2 months. But I want to have it be the start of my 2025 pro season. One thing real briefly, Steve, I know you need to go to sleep. The WNBF announced that it's going to have classic physique.
Oh, yeah, it did. Is that
and
tempting you?
I think. Well, here's the thing. There are ways to do classic physique that I love, and there's ways to do classic physique and natural bodybuilding that I hate, right? The version of classic, and we don't know what the WNBF is going to do yet. What I love about the classic physique division, or one aspect of it, is the emphasis on posing and a throwback to the artistry. And like, you know, for example, Terrence, man, like, oof, like an amazing poser and kind of a respect for that. So I love the idea of judging posing a little bit more, presentation, transition, and being able to have a little more artistic interpretation of the mandatories and having some free posing. I think that is a kind of a cool throwback. But what I don't like is that in the enhanced ranks where it got introduced, the guys are killing themselves to get shredded, right? They are diced. No one says classic physique competitors aren't as lean, if not leaner, than the open division. They're just smaller. It's, you know, it's PED's light because there's a height cap. And introducing the height weight cap or the whole like less muscular division concept to natural bodybuilding, I don't think makes any sense. And anytime you have ambiguous levels of muscularity, you get these strange, like multiple years of poor judging before the class kind of finds itself. And I think in natural bodybuilding organizations where they ask the classic physique competitors to not be as lean or not be as muscular, it just looks like the 8 weeks out division. And a lot of the times it either stays like that, which I just don't find that interesting or that compelling. I'm not going to do it if it's like that. Or it slowly slides to where it is the same as bodybuilding. So I hope that the WNBF kind of stakes its flag in the ground on this is a posing and symmetry emphasis division, but we're not changing, the leanness that is required. But if you sacrifice, say, your symmetry or your fullness for leanness, and the fact that the trunks cover up your glutes, so maybe you're not going to push as hard to get striated glutes. So kind of by side effect, the competitors aren't necessarily trying to get absolutely peeled. I think that would be a good thing. And I have been told that I would do well in such a division because I'm not the biggest guy in the world. But if it's, if I would get penalized for being shredded, I'm not going to do that division, period. Done. Like, I don't care. So, yeah, if it is a posing emphasized division, I'm down. I will absolutely do classic physique. I think that'd be really cool. So
very cool. Yeah, I know you have a lot of love for kind of the golden era and classic kind of physiques and the posing there. So yeah, I'm interested to judge it because that'll just be interesting to have to do that. I'm imagining it might come into the WF UK this year because we had the golden era round. I don't know if you know that, but that was just all based off posing, basically, in the end. So we didn't judge it based off physique because it was just like the guy that won this class just will win because he's the biggest and leanest again. So it was like, right, let's judge it via posing. And that was useful. And yeah, the guys that are winning the class in open bodybuilding aren't always the most like classically posed individuals, so it does open up, I think, room for other people to kind of place higher in that class. So I do think it needs to be distinct, so that'll be really cool to see how it all comes out. But yeah, if you get involved in that, I'll definitely be interested to see how that goes. But yeah, Eric, best of luck for the rest of your gaining, and everyone will be watching. I know I will be with interest for your season this year, and thank you again for taking the time and coming on. I'll make sure all your usual links to the mass, the 3DMJ guys, yourself there, your Instagram is all linked below too, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate it.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality and we know how to do it. And we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.